A late-night flight in Russia ends in a harrowing crash. Investigators search for a mechanical explanation for the crash. But when they dig deeper, they make a shocking discovery. It's the middle of the night in Russia. A passenger jet is 45 minutes from touching down in Perm, a city in central Russia. There are 82 passengers on board. Most of them are Russian. 43-year-old First Officer Rustem Alaberdin is the pilot fly tonight. The captain, Rodion Medvedev, 34, is monitoring the instruments and radio communications. The two have only flown together twice before. Aeroflot-Nord is a regional airline and a subsidiary of Russia's state-owned airline Aeroflot. Flight 821 lifts off from Moscow just after 1 in the morning. The plane is making a 2-hour journey to Perm and then returning to the Russian capital. Captain Medvedev and First Officer Alaberdin are flying a 16-year-old American-built Boeing 737. The twin-engine plane has clocked almost 45,000 flying hours. Aeroflot-Nord leased the plane in March 2008 to expand its fleet. The plan for Flight 821 is to approach from the west, turn right, and land on runway 21.
Good evening, good morning. This is your captain speaking. We began our descent in...
Throughout the flight, the two engines have been operating at different power levels. That forces the first officer to make constant steering adjustments to keep the plane on course. The crew now prepares for landing. The first officer notices the plane is veering left, so he brings it back on course. In the tower, the controller sees that Flight 821 is now climbing instead of descending. The first officer adjusts the pitch of the plane to resume the descent. But now the controller sees Flight 821 has flown past the approach path. He instructs the crew to loop around and restart their landing. Flight 821 continues to ignore the instruction to turn right. And then his radar shows the plane banking left and veering off course. In the cockpit, it's now chaos. The plane has crashed onto the Trans-Siberian Railway on the outskirts of Perm, Russia. It had nearly 8 tons of fuel on board. Local firefighters and rescue workers rush to the crash site. Sunrise reveals the extent of the damage to Aeroflot-Nord Flight 821. Nothing is left but charred wreckage. All 88 people on board die in the accident. Russian authorities labor around the clock to clear the wreckage of Aeroflot-Nord Flight 821 from the crash site on the Trans-Siberian Railway. They need to get the trains running again. Meanwhile, Russian investigators from the Interstate Aviation Committee, the IAC, will work to find the cause of this tragic accident. American investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board join the team. Photos of Flight 821's crash site offer up clues about the orientation and pitch of the plane when it hit the ground. Russian investigators need to understand what could have provoked a catastrophic loss of control just minutes before landing. The first priority is checking the weather conditions at the time of the crash. The cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder were so badly damaged in the fire that they had to be sent to a specialized facility in France to retrieve the data. It could take weeks for results to return. In the meantime, the Russian investigators brief the Americans on their progress. After scouring through the wreckage and examining the impact details, investigators are certain Flight 821 was intact before it crashed. With the crash of Aeroflot-Nord 821 still a mystery, investigators need to find out if the 737 was mechanically sound when it took off from Moscow. Investigators learned that during Flight 821, the engines were producing asymmetrical thrust. When one engine is producing more power than the other, the airplane will rotate or yaw. Investigators discover that just the day before the crash, different pilots who flew the same plane were so concerned about the problem. They took photographs to show how far the thrust levers needed to be staggered. It's a crucial lead. Investigators now know there was a problem with the mismatched engines, and they know the pilots were aware of it. The question is, did they know how to fly the plane with imbalanced engines? Still looking for leads in the case of Flight 821, the team shifts the focus to the pilots. The Tupolev 134 was one of the most widely used jets in the former Soviet bloc, but it required twice as many crew members to fly them as a modern Western jet like a Boeing or Airbus. The placement of the engines on the Tupolev is also different. The engines are close together at the rear of the plane. Mismatched engines require minimal adjustment since the thrust is all coming from the back. A Boeing 737's engines are spaced apart, slung beneath the wings. With a mismatch in engine power, the stronger side pushes the wing up and requires the pilot's constant correction of control surfaces to maintain balance. Investigators now take a hard look at how much the pilots knew about flying the 737. While investigators discovered that the first officer had 9,000 flying hours, the captain had much less, only 3,900 hours, less than 1,200 of which were on the 737. Every pilot's training should be fully documented. But when Captain Medvedev's training records arrive, investigators are shocked that Captain Medvedev's training on the Boeing 737 was woefully inadequate. The team knows First Officer Alaberdin had much more flying experience than the captain. What they now need to find out is if the first officer was any better equipped to fly the 737. Investigators learned that one thing the first officer especially struggled with was flying with thrust asymmetry.
Check the speed you're banking.
Bank angle. Bank
You're
angle.
banking.
Bank angle. Bank.
This is the third time.
Bank angle.
Investigators are astonished by the extent of the first officer's shortcomings on the 737. The team determined that the airline should never have paired a new captain with such an unproven first officer. The investigation team continues to study the flight data to better understand what happened on board Aeroflot-Nord Flight 821. They have learned the first hour and a half of the flight was uneventful. But when 821 starts the approach, things go terribly wrong. The right engine is operating at 61%, but the left is near 40%. As the plane banks steeply to the right, the auto throttle can't handle such a large split in engine power. Now the first officer has to manage the massive stagger in the thrust levers himself. The thing he couldn't do in training. What investigators discover next is even more puzzling. As the first officer begins the final bright turn towards the runway, he performs a series of actions that disengage the autopilot. He turns the yoke right, pushes it forward, and engages the stabilizer trim in sequence. This signals to the autopilot that the pilot wants to take manual control, even if he doesn't. Investigators are astounded to discover that even though the autopilot is now off, neither pilot makes any changes to throttle, to pitch or roll for a full 25 seconds. The team now knows more of the technical details that contributed to Flight 821's crash. But why things spiraled out of control in the cockpit is still unknown. Finally, investigators get the cockpit voice recorder that captured the last 30 minutes of flight. They hope it will provide the answers they need. With the autothrottle disengaged, the mismatched engines cause the plane to veer left. He now makes the series of inputs that forces the autopilot to disconnect. This causes the aircraft to climb and continue banking left instead of descending to the right. The captain is looking at the 737's ADI, but confuses it with an Eastern-style ADI like on the Tupolev. The ADI, or Attitude Director Indicator, is the instrument that displays an aircraft's orientation relative to the horizon. The ADI in older planes from Eastern Bloc countries worked just the opposite. The horizon is fixed, and the airplane symbol moves. It's a huge difference. But one last mystery remains. The team investigating the crash of Flight 821 has determined that pilot error led to the tragic accident that killed 88 people. The first officer couldn't handle the mismatched engines, but the captain refused to take control of the situation.
Take it! Take it!
Take what? I can't do it either.
In order to better understand the psychological state of the pilots, investigators have analyzed the pitch of their voices. They wonder if stress played a role in the crash. The analysis reveals that the captain was at a high level of stress throughout the entire flight. Investigators learned that just prior to takeoff, a passenger sent a text to her friend in the United Kingdom. The passenger said she was scared because the captain sounded totally drunk. The captain's muscle tissue has been tested for traces of alcohol. The analysis confirms that there was alcohol in his system before the crash. In its final report, the investigative team recommends a complete overhaul of the Russian aviation system. 3 years after the crash, Aeroflot sold Aeroflot-Nord. It now operates as a separate airline called Nordavia,